Hello, everybody. Welcome back again. This is lecture 5 of our course on the making of the Chinese Buddhist Canon. And for this lecture, we turn to printing. The moment of printing was such a big issue for world culture, as well as for Buddhism, and certainly for the Chinese Buddhist canon. Prior to the time of printing, the manuscripts, that is the handwritten canonic texts in China, were numerous, they were widespread, and there was a major industry of making manuscript copies, particularly of famous texts. So certain monasteries in China, that was one of their main supports, is that they were copy centers. So if you wanted a copy of the Heart Sutra, what do? You go to one of the copy center monasteries, you take the paper with you, you give them the paper, and you give them a donation. And in due course, somebody will make a copy and you can go back and pick it up. We have one story of one of these large copy centers. Somebody came and looked in their warehouse and saw stacks and stacks of paper and said to them, you guys are rich, because of course, paper was like currency. If you had a roll of paper, you could use it like it was money. So you guys have all that paper out there, why don't you start selling it? And they said, well, we don't actually own that paper. The paper that's in the warehouse that you see, that's paper that people have brought to us for us to make a copy of a sutra on. And we just have a lot of backlog of work to do. So we don't own it. It belongs to all those people who have given us a donation to make a copy of a sutra. So the need for copies was great. And as you can see, it was very hard and maybe a very long time before you could actually have even the smallest text of your own from one of these copy centers. So then print comes along. And you've already seen the next slide, but these are mainly the great collections of printed canons of China. We don't have such a map of the old copy centers of China. I hope somebody will someday make such a map for us. It would be great to know exactly where these copy centers were. I don't know that we'll ever know exactly how many texts they copied by hand. But here is what happened when print came into effect. As you can see, these were major monasteries. And now, instead of going and taking them paper to make a manuscript copy, people would go to them with paper to make a copy of the print for a rubbing of their blocks. Well, that was no small thing. It was not as if an ordinary person could just go to one of these places and walk up with a great pack of paper and say, print me a copy of the Canon. That's not possible. It's interesting that when the first print was made, when they had a printed copy, they had jet lag in terms of what it meant to have a printed copy. At first, they said, how wonderful. Now we have a copy to give to the copy centers, and they will all be making copies of the same edition of the Canon. In other words, they couldn't think outside the box of manuscripts. They just saw printing as an adjunct to the manuscript, and that the prints could be taken to monasteries who would then become copy centers and distribute it in the old-fashioned way. I think technology always has a jet lag. I think that people always are thinking about the old days. It's like myself, when I first got a computer, I didn't use it as a computer. I used it as a glorified typewriter. It was very good. I could correct, I could change, but I could store it, and it was wonderful. But I didn't yet know how to use this software for analysis or the other things which would later come into existence for all of us. So as we enter the print world in China, we have to remember that it was brand new. They didn't quite know what to do about it. What did it mean to have these printing blocks where you could make many copies? I remember that this was very forcefully presented to me once. In Hong Kong, they made a digital copy of all the Chinese classics. And the reason was that they used that to print a paper copy of 18 volumes at great expense. That's what they used that digital version for. I went to them and said, I don't want 18 copies. I don't want 18 volumes. I want the digital. Give me the digital so I can search it and use it in the way that I now use the computer. No, it was made specifically to make a paper print, and that's all it's to be used for. We can't release the digital version. Well, that's jet lag. That's not recognizing what you have at your fingertips. The Chinese didn't know what they had at their fingertips at first when they got printing. We didn't know what to do with the computer copy that was on our at our fingertips when that first came into existence. Well, it was not until the Northern Song that the printing of the Chinese Buddhist canon actually took place. The Song had just conquered and taken control of lands to the west, and included in those new areas that they had gotten control of was the city of Chengdu. Chengdu was known at that time as the wood carving capital of China. They had forests which they could use for their printing blocks. or for whatever carved wooden objects were needed. So the emperor was in Kaifeng, a long distance away, and he sent a letter to Chengdu. And he said, I want you to make a set of printing blocks for all the Jing, for all the classics, the Buddhist classics that are in the monastic library, Dazheng. As far as I can tell, that's all that he did. He just told him, I want you to do this. This is what coming from the emperor, so of course, people are going to do it. Some people have said this was newly conquered territory. They were mainly wood carvers. So the emperor wanted to make them happy, wanted to keep them busy, wanted to keep them from rebelling. So he gave them this huge task of making 80-some thousand printing blocks for the Buddhist canon. And they did it from manuscripts that were held in a monastic library in Chengdu. They made it in a special format, however. Up to that point in the manuscript tradition, most Chinese texts had 17 characters per line. But as they carved it in Chengdu, they only used 14. There are several possible reasons for this. One is that if you make the characters larger, they're not so fragile when you rub. If you carve very tiny characters that have slender little projections, when you make a rubbing, those will break off. So to make it larger meant that you made something which would last a longer time. I read once somebody said in a rather, I think, satirical fashion, of course, if you make it 14 characters per line, it's more pages. And if you're paid by the page, you want to make as many pages as you can. I don't know that I subscribe to that one. Anyway, they set off to Chengdu. They carved the canon as they had it in their library. They put it on ox carts and shipped it to Kaifeng. They had never made a rubbing of it. It went to Kaifeng. When it got there was consternation. The Sung was an empire of standardization. They were standardizing weights, measures. They made a new standard for the Chinese characters, which ones were acceptable, which ones were correct. And when they got this collection of wooden printing blocks from Chengdu, the people there had simply copied exactly as the texts were in their library. And those texts were filled with old non-standard characters. Now, it was against the law to make copies of the old standard. You had to use the new standard. So then the question came, should we burn these printing blocks because they're filled with non-standard characters? But they were reasonable people, and they said, let's go ahead and use them, even if they have the non-standard characters. So that's why when you look at the Korean and you look at the Jin and you look at other collections made from those, if you're really following truly to what you're looking at, they will carry those old non-standard characters that were found on the manuscripts in Chengdu at the time when these texts were being carved. So Chengdu was a big story for the Buddhist printing. We still don't know exactly which manuscripts were used, whether any of them survive. We also don't know how good the manuscripts were. They had been manuscripts that had been copied many times. So it's still in the air as to what we will do with understanding what we have in the Chinese prints. Now I showed you that once the Kaibao was the name for this set of prints from Chengdu, the Kaibao edition was then used politically. It was not something that was easily copied. To make a copy of thousands of pages of printing blocks is a huge task because the ink is wet. You have to take the sheets and hang them on clotheslines to let dry. You can only do the rubbing during the time when the blocks are not frozen, as in the winter. You can't do it in the middle of summer when it's very humid, the ink won't dry. So there are big issues to make these copies. But what the court at Kaifeng did is they sent them as royal gifts. That is, they made copies. And it was a gift that was very nice, but at the same time, it was a gift that implied to the people who received it, look at us in Kaifeng. We are the master of a whole new technology. This is something which you've never seen before, and we make you a gift of our superior technology. So they sent copies to the Korean court. They sent another set to the Jin people, the Liao. And they tried to send one to the Khitan people, and they probably did, but the Khitan people said they were resistant to the fact that this was showing the superiority of the Song technology. They looked it over and said, you know, our manuscripts are better than what we find here. So we'll just make a set of our own printing blocks from our manuscripts. And you just keep on distributing these collections of your Chengdu manuscripts. When we look at the Kaibao and we look at the Korean, when we still have a copy of what they copied, and we look at the Jin dynasty, the Liao people, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, we see that the Kaibao was traced and that copies were being made of the Kaibao, not rewriting it as a manuscript, but tracing the outline of the characters on thin paper and using that tracing on the wood blocks which were cut in Korea and among the Jin people. So the spread of the Buddhist canon now has taken a new form. And it means that in a way, everyone begins to have pretty much the same set of texts. Manuscript collections across China would have been very varied. They didn't all have the same text. They didn't all have them in the same order. Now with printing made by the Kaibao, we can say that there's a pretty standard edition of the Chinese Buddhist canon. And it was being made available, and the prints were sent as these kingly gifts. Well, the Koreans took this new technology and they like the Khitan wanted to be up to date. So the first thing they did in Korea was to make this set of printing blocks, which we call the Koryo dynasty. We call it the Koryo 1 edition. They made their tracings, they made their blocks. But then trouble came. Trouble came to Korea in the form of the Mongols. The Mongol Empire was expanding, as we know, all the way across Eurasia to Poland. It would eventually conquer China. But at that time, the Mongols had already come to the boundary of Korea, and they conquered Korea. The court fled from their capital, which is like Kaesong, and they went to an island, Konghwa Island, and continued to exist as a court. The Mongols didn't have enough people to rule all this huge territory. It was impossible. How many thousands and thousands of soldiers is it going to take if you have the largest empire the world has ever known? How are you going to man it? And so the approach was that so long as people would pay tribute to them, would not attempt to revolt, they would leave them alone. And in many ways, they could continue to be self-governing. So the king of Korea, the emperor of Korea, has gone to Konghwa Island. But there was one very sad event. When the Mongols first came to Korea, the Korean court made a mistake. They said to the envoy from the Mongols, "We're not afraid of you. We have this powerful talisman. We have this powerful thing which protects us and protects our nation." The Mongols naturally asked, "Well, what is this powerful thing?" And they said, "We have a set of printing blocks for the Buddhist canon, and it is used to protect our nation." The Mongols thought about this and decided that they couldn't let this go by, so they burned it. They burned the entire set of printing blocks, which the Koreans had made from the Kaibao gift from China. So when the emperor was exiled, if you will, to Kanghua Island, which is a fairly sizable island. But when I first went there, I thought it's an island. It's out in the sea. You have to cross in boats. And I found out that the crossing was more like crossing a small river. It was barely an island, barely an island. While they were on Kanghua, though, the emperor set about recarving all of the blocks. Here he was, isolated, exiled to this island. And the one thing that he felt the country needed was to have their old protector of the nation back again, which was a set of printing blocks. So on Kanghua Island, as far as we know, they started to recarve. We get some hint of what was happening. They were told put the lumber for the carvings in the salt water of the sea where they were, had it saturated for 2 years, and then took it out and dried it before they started to carve. That set of printing blocks, and they finished it. They actually did it within a relatively few decades. They finished recarving the whole thing. They redid it from the rubbings they had made of the blocks that the Mongols had burned. Later, they decided that it was too dangerous to leave it at Kanghua. It was unprotected. And so they moved it inland. And they took it to where is now Hainsa in the mountains to the south. And there they built, as you can see in the Hainsa Monastery, you'll see the 2 long buildings in the back. That's where they housed these printing blocks from the second set of carvings. It's fantastic to go and see this place. I first went there in 1970, can you imagine? A long time ago. I think I was the only person who was wandering around at that time. You could just walk into those buildings and you could handle the blocks, if you could imagine such a thing. Nobody was yet aware of. They knew it was important. They liked it, but they also had not enough support in terms of preservation, and other things would come later. The collection there was periodically copied. That is, rubbings were made. And that's how it came into my life. I already knew about it before I went there. When I was an acting assistant professor, no lower academic rank can exist, at Berkeley for my first year there, they told me that one thing they wanted me to do was not only teach, but also to help the library make a catalog, because they had purchased from Hain Monastery in Korea a set of rubbings from thousands of printing blocks. So there they were, 1,500 volumes, the way in which they were sewn. And that's when I began to make my catalog of that canon. So to go there and to see the actual blocks when I first went in 1970 was a great thrill for me. So went back to China. Printing, as I mentioned, maybe printing is different than stamping. Stamping is you press down on paper, and as you press down, you make the image on the upside of the paper as you press on it. Printing, you ink a printing block, you put the paper on top of the printing block, you rub it and pounce it till it makes an imprint from the inked characters underneath that are reverse. And then you pull the sheet of paper off, and of course the letters come up right side. And that's true printing. Some of the earliest texts in China that are called prints technically are not prints, but are stamps. They made kind of yearly almanac calendar type of things that were distributed widely throughout China. And it's called printing, but they made a big stamp for it and pressed it down. They didn't put the paper on it and rub it and make a true print. In addition to the Canon, another very large printing process took place. It's called the Million Scrolls. Emperor Shotoku is said to have given an order to make 1 million wooden pagodas in order to acquire merit. And in each of those wooden pagodas, to place a small rolled up piece of paper with dharanis, that is esoteric tantric dharanis on them. And these million pagodas basically were then given as gifts. We find them spread throughout the world. Many of them are still in the old capital. And the question is, this was in the 8th century, so it was very early for printing, and printing in Japan already. The issue was, and people have fought over this, scholars argue, were these rolled up scrolls inside the pagodas made from woodblock or copper plate? That is, was it carved woodblock that was used to make the copies of them for the million? Or was it etching on a copper plate? And that battle has still going on. There are scholars in Japan who have looked carefully at the scrolls inside the pagodas, and some of them say they are definitely stamped, not printed. But we have prints also. And the question is, are the stamps the original, and do we have forgeries that were later printed because everybody wanted one of these little pagodas with this dharani scroll? If you become interested in this kind of work, you magnify the surface you look to see if the ink that you see is from wood or copper. And you can see here that the ink on the top two squares are from wood, and the bottom blue aqua is from copper. The way the ink spreads was dependent upon the surface of the item which was used to make prints. So we have ways, and any of you who get interested in this sort of thing, you have to become a chemist. You have to use as big a magnifier as you can get. It's exciting work, exciting work. The printing blocks, such as the ones made in Korea, and this is one of the Korean printing blocks, were carved on both sides. So you could make a print from both sides of many of the blocks. Then how do you preserve a block? Blocks are really susceptible. Termites love them. Not only the termites, but mildew, organisms of all types attack the blocks. The drying out process, the wood begins to crack, moisture enters in. It's very hard to keep these blocks preserved. So one of the ways that they have tried to do, and not all of them have been done this way, but a lot of them have been lacquered. They lacquered the block. That is, they put lacquer on it. I'll talk about that in a minute. And they also used metal shields on the ends of many of the blocks to preserve them from cracking and becoming disintegrating in that fashion. So the blocks have been pretty well preserved. As amazing as the blocks are, the buildings they're in Korea are just as exciting. Those two long buildings are open air. They have open windows. They are not made airtight. And the remarkable thing that scientists in Korea discovered is that the temperature in those buildings, because of the way the airflow works, is never more than a few degrees different from the outside. In other words, when the doors are opened in a house that's heated, it's very cold outside, you walk inside a warm house, you know what it's like. You have this rush of heat, but not in these buildings. They're open air so that they have no differential of temperature, which would be, over the centuries, quite destructive to them. So they've been preserved in quite good order. I mentioned that they were lacquered. I don't know how many of you know about lacquer, but lacquer comes from the lacquer tree. Particularly in the Japanese, lacquer is considered very good, but so is the Korean and Chinese. The lacquer tree is they cut into the bark, it weeps the sap flows out. They catch the sap from the tree, and that's the main way in which the lacquer is gathered. Insects don't like it. It dries and makes a very long-lasting hard surface. It's a wonderful product. So that the fact that they lacquered the blocks in Korea turns out to have been really successful. You know, museums and preservation, sometimes in doing their preservation, it turns out they cause more trouble than they save. For example, if you try to save paper documents, the French decided at one time at the Musée Guimet that they would paste a very thin layer of silk over the paper to preserve it. But then you can never remove the silk. And if any problem occurs underneath the silk, there's no way to get there. Sometimes people have put things between glass, but once some of the things are put between glass, you can never undo it because it would shatter the object. So preservation is a big issue, and how you do it is a big issue. Making rubbings from the printing blocks was a process in itself, as I mentioned. I talked to the monks at Hainsa who made the last rubbing was done in the 1960s of those printing blocks. The monks who did it hated it. It was very hard work. There was constant trouble with getting the ink to dry. How many pages can you have? How many closed lines, etc. Was very demanding, very hard work. They made 12 sets, which they sold to help support the monastery. We don't know where all the 12 went, unless they've recently discovered it, but I haven't heard that they have. When we got our set at Berkeley, it was common knowledge. Berkeley paid them. And yet, there were 2 sets which nobody knew where they were. So obviously there was some situation where money was exchanged, copies were sent, and nobody knows quite what went on. It probably was not to be known. To make copies requires affiliate technology. And the affiliate technology, as we've been working with in this class, are the surfaces on which it was placed, and all kinds of associate technology. One of those was making ink. How do you make ink that will last and be not destroy the paper? And these were big issues. The Chinese made ink by boiling animal hooves and hides until they got just the collagen and out of those animal products, which you can see here, these little beautiful golden crystals made from the boiling. So that's why sometimes you hear the expression that a horse is going to get sent to the glue factory. And in fact, many horses, when they were put down, their bodies were sent to glue factories. And they were boiled and boiled and boiled until you got these crystals. The ink also had to have color. Color came primarily from soot. The soot was made from burning pine trees. You don't burn it completely, of course. The residue, which is left in the vents, like we have in stoves, soot is then added to the animal glue, and you've made ink. The Chinese went one step further with technology, which I think was really a fantastic thing that they did. They decided that, of course, if you make ink, you've got this liquid. Well, we all know about that. And the liquid ink is always getting on your clothes, it's spilling. We have all kinds of problems with it. So the Chinese developed the ink stick. They simply made a way to store ink in a concrete stick that could be then rubbed so that the ink would be dissolved in water and then be available for use. It was an ingenious way to make ink into a solid bar rather than keep leaving it as liquid. And it also meant that you could use ink stones. Some people feel that in the beginning, the ink sticks were being rubbed against ceramic objects, but it's really natural stone has been the great use for the ink sticks. You have these ink stones where you rub the ink stick and get some of the black color mixed with your water, and you have usable ink. So I'm just saying all of this. This is the allied technology that the Buddhist canon in China, it could not have been done without boiling animals. It could not have been done without having soot and burning pine trees. These technology issues were very important. Well, later on, of course, we have movable type. Movable type was different than a wood block. A wood block was what they carved on a piece of a board, and it was permanent. If you made a mistake, the only thing they could possibly do to correct a mistake on a printing block was to cut the thing out, make a plug, make a new piece with the right character, and press it back into the hole. But it was extremely difficult, and it was dangerous because you might split the whole block. With movable type, a lot of advantages. You could use the type over and over. You could make them into whatever text you wanted. But of course, you had to put them in the right order. Just like with manuscripts, putting them in the right order for the print meant you could make mistakes. Movable type was never as assuredly the same as the old wood blocks. So you pay a price for whatever you do. Today we have the computer print. We just don't think about very much, but sending a command to a machine that says print, and lo and behold, out comes a copy in color. And we take all this for granted. So the whole era of print for the Chinese Buddhist canon was the introduction of a new technology which would not be equaled, I think, until the computer. The technology of writing came first, then printing, and then digital prints. So we're living in an age of similar to what the print culture of the Song Dynasty was going through. We are in an era where a new technology has taken over and is still not sure what the final results of this new technology for us will be. So when the Chinese had print and the Buddhist canon could be preserved in a standardized form and an exact copy could be made by rubbings, and an exact copy could be given as a royal gift and politicized. All of these are indicators that when we start to study something, it takes not just one discipline or two or three. It takes any discipline that touches on what we're working with. So I'm really always been very interested in the printing of the Chinese Buddhist canon. And certainly the Hainsaw collection of prints that took me 7 years to catalog took quite a hunk out of my life. And I go there once still, and when I was traveling, go there with a feeling of reverence for what's there, the power of the printed word, the fact that the Koreans would take this technology, make it their own, put it onto their own wooden surfaces, is a thrill. So when we look at the printing of the Chinese Buddhist canon, it is definitely a part of its long and glorious history. Thank you very much.